Well, hello everyone. Good morning and happy Easter. I'm glad to be with you all today as we work on the next week's lesson for God's story. And today I've got a good lesson for you because this is one of my favorites and I think it's one that you will get a lot out of. We're going to be talking about Episcopal Beginnings. It's the way the Episcopal Church started in the U.S. And this is a very interesting kind of lesson because this is really our stuff, like our direct stuff. And so I know that in previous lessons, you've been discussing ideas about the way that England, the Church of England, came to the U.S. and began to establish churches. And so I'm going to just do a little bit of an overlap over that information so that we're all on the same page. So let's begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of this technology that allows us to remain connected even though we are physically separated. May this time together be a blessing on each one of us to help enrich our understanding of our tradition, inspire us to new forms of discipleship, and keep us mindful of the work of your kingdom here on earth and how we can play our part. All this we ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so none of us need to be reminded of the American Revolution, but we want to take just a quick step back. As the colonies came and established themselves in America, England was one of those great powers that was very present. And with England's colonies came England's religion. So the Church of England was the Anglican branch of Christianity. And I think many of you have heard me say before that there are really four major branches of Christianity. You've got Roman Catholic and Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox is sometimes what it's called. Then you've got the Reformed traditions. You've got the Protestant Reformation, and then you've got the Anglican Reformation. They happened concurrently, and you know, I've said it before, we are not Protestant, we are Anglican. And that kind of Anglican Reformed Christian tradition took a while to establish, but by the time we get to the American colonial period, they pretty much know what Church of England is. And so Church of England comes over, embeds itself in the colonies because people just wanted to go to church. So they wanted to go to church the way that they went to church in England. And it remained a faith group that really was for the people in power, right? These are the English people who were the landowners. They were the ones that ran the businesses. They were the ones that led the political arms and made political decisions. And so they really are the ones who established the Church of England, particularly in the Northeast. That worked for a bit, and then you may remember that at some point, the Americans decided they didn't want to be ruled by the British anymore. And so they began a little skirmish that had some, difficult results. But ultimately what happens is that the Church of England's presence in the U.S. is challenged in the same way that the political and economic power is challenged here during the Revolution. It is difficult to imagine, at least it is for me, what it would be like to kind of like the English, to be yoked to the English. Church of England church members here in America would have been yoked to England, and they would have been yoked to England for a couple generations. This did not happen immediately. They would have been going to church here. They would have been going to church in that Anglican way, but here in America. And when the revolution begins, I have to think that many of those families were torn because you had a relative unity, a relative faithfulness and fidelity to a tradition that their families could have been connected to for generations, but they also lived in America. And either they were sympathetic to the American revolutionaries or they were sympathetic to the English. Either way, being associated with England was not a good thing, whether you liked it or not. And so during the American Revolution, although northern clergy, Anglican clergy, tried to stay unified with England, it just didn't quite work. And post-revolution, even with those connections, the church really had to change. They had to transition. They couldn't be the Church of England in America anymore. Speaking of, the specific name for the Church of England in America was the English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. I want to take a little pause and separate out how the Church of England functioned as England spread its colonial authority around the world. Currently, every nation that has an English church, basically, this is not perfect, but most countries that have a branch of Anglicanism have a national Anglican church. In America, that is the Episcopal Church. But in other places, you get the word Anglican, like the Anglican Church of Canada, and so on. When England began to sail around the world and plant colonies, for a period of time, they were simply English churches all over the world. It wasn't until later that the Anglican Communion, which is effectively branches of Anglican Christianity, established themselves around the world. So we have America to sort of thank for transitioning the Church of England from home base in England with just satellites all over the world to actually establishing effectively local Anglican churches in nations around the world. And that ball began to roll with earnest when America kind of created their own church. We weren't the first, but it was the first big shift toward what would ultimately be national churches, national versions of the Anglican Church. So let's get back to the American Revolution. American Revolution ends. And the American Revolution is successful, obviously, in breaking ties with England. And so all of these Anglican Christians who had been worshiping very happily here in America didn't want to abandon their church, didn't want to abandon their theology and their way of being, but they also knew they couldn't just be English Christians anymore. That was not going to fly. So they began to get creative, and they wanted to do a few things that differentiated them from the Church of England. First, they knew they had to devise and specify a constitution for the church in America, for what the Anglican Church in America would be. That was not an easy thing to do, because effectively, they didn't have a model for this, right? In the same way that the founders of the country were trying to figure out how they wanted to be different, the faith leaders in America who were Anglican were trying to figure out how they wanted to be different. So they began working on a constitution about the Anglican Church in the United States, or in America at that time. They wanted to revise the English prayer book. This is the second thing. They had inherited a Book of Common Prayer from England, but they knew that it needed to be something different in America. They had to adopt the American principles, the American identity that is different than what it was in England. And so, in addition to drafting a constitution that would define the church in America, they also wanted to update and revise the prayer book from England into something that would be a better fit for the American church. Third, they had to figure out how they could obtain or consecrate or form bishops here in America. So, we've got three things to talk about. The first is drafting this binding constitution. Most of you likely know that the great majority of founders of the United States were actually Anglicans. So much of what took shape in the Episcopal Church is what took shape in the government of America. So in the way that we've got two houses that effectively govern the country, they're the legislative branch of government. You've got Senate and House of Representatives. You kind of have the same thing in the Episcopal Church. So once the Episcopal Church was established, you had two basic houses that help to decide legislation, to devise rules and create boundaries around what we can and cannot do as a tradition to keep us yoked together. The first house is the House of Bishops. And the House of Bishops is sort of like the Senate. You can kind of think of it that way. The Senate is made up of equal representation from each state. The House of Bishops is effectively equal representation from each diocese. So I'll pause here just so that we're all on the same page. In the same way that the nation, the United States, divided up into states and then counties, the Episcopal Church divided themselves up into dioceses. So for some dioceses, they are a single state. That's not common. Most of the time, a state is divided up into multiple dioceses. For medium-sized states, you probably have 2 or 3. For big states like Texas, you have as many as 6 or 8. It helps a bishop to manage parishes and people if the geography of the diocese is not extreme. Unfortunately, some states out west that have low population density have gigantic geographic regions for dioceses. But for us here in Texas, our geography is pretty reasonable. Although it's larger than some, it is doable that a bishop could actually traverse a diocese and visit the parishes. Population has shifted, obviously. We know that in North Texas, places like Dallas, Houston, San Antonio have grown so quickly that 100 years ago, they wouldn't have thought that the geography would be a problem, and now it has become one, but that's a different story. In the Episcopal Church, dioceses maintain their own authority. A bishop for a diocese, there's only one in any diocese, a diocesan bishop, is the ultimate legal authority for that diocese. Sort of like, it gets messy when I apply it to the government, so I won't even try. Instead, I'll say diocesan bishop, ultimate authority. However, if a diocesan bishop goes off the rails, so to speak, in one way or the other, there is a higher body that can be appealed to in order to correct a bishop going off the range. That is General Convention. And General Convention is structured into 2 houses. This gets back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. We've got 2 houses that balance and legislate for the entire church. They meet once every 3 years, and the 2 houses somewhat mimic the kind of balance of power between House of Representatives and the Senate. So, back to House of Bishops. Like the Senate, relatively equal representation based on each diocese. Every diocese has one diocesan bishop. Those bishops are in the House of Bishops. Occasionally, dioceses will have an assisting bishop or a suffragan bishop. Don't worry about it. That's kind of an extra bishop or 2. They will also be part of the House of Bishops, but most dioceses only have a single. The House of Deputies is based on population, similar to the House of Representatives. So House of Bishops, they get a relatively even distribution, but House of Deputies has a distribution based on total number of Episcopalians in a diocese. And so that's where you get a much bigger group because it is based on population, not just kind of a 1-to-1. And that's made up of both ordained and lay Episcopalians together. Typically priests, deacons, and lay leaders all make up the House of Deputies. Those houses get together and they do things in between the conventions, but a general convention happens every 3 years, and they're able to make some pretty big deal decisions to help guide the Episcopal Church over time. So that's the constitutional structure of the Episcopal Church that was established after the Revolution. In addition, the second thing that they had to do is revise the prayer book. So you and I use the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. That is a revision that is in a long string of revisions that began right after the Revolution with the first American prayer book. Now, the very first American prayer book was very similar to the English prayer book because at that point, they weren't too far removed from England itself. Over time, the prayer book has evolved to reflect what I might call a more American sensibility versus an English sensibility. 1928 is the immediate past prayer book. The new prayer book that a lot of people say, even though it was published before I was born, the new prayer book came in 1979. And so as you see, there's a decently long period of time between prayer book revisions. I've received a few questions before about whether I think a new prayer book is coming anytime soon. I will tell you that has been postponed in a formal sense. And many leaders in the Episcopal Church now wonder if there will ever be a formal new prayer book, because we've got such ease of technology now. We can share liturgies and we can share prayers in a way that almost makes a very finite book kind of superfluous. So for now, no new one is coming, but that's always a question that looms over any convention of the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies, is whether or not we should update it again. But that's the second thing that the American Church needed when they established itself. But the third is where things get a little interesting. I mentioned that in order to propagate a new church in America, the third thing they needed were American bishops. That might seem easy, but there's a little snag. So to ordain a deacon or a priest, you only need one bishop. But to ordain or consecrate a bishop, you actually need 3 bishops. That's because we, in our tradition, as Episcopalians or as Anglican Christians, we have what is called Apostolic Succession. Apostolic succession is something we share with other Christian groups like the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, where we can, in theory, trace every ordination back by the hands. The bishop who touched me was ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, and on and on and on, all the way back to Peter himself, and of course, Peter being touched by or ordained by or empowered by Jesus. Apostolic succession is something that we as Episcopalians take very seriously. We're one of the only traditions that has it. And in order to maintain the sanctity of that succession, 3 bishops are needed to ordain a priest. Why 3, you ask? Probably because some very sensible Englishman at one point said, well, if it happens that one bishop's ordination is proven to be improper or invalid, would that mean that all the priests that they ordain are improper and invalid? And so someone probably said, well, we should probably have at least 2, so that in case one is marked as invalid at some point, or they do something wrong, or who knows, then the other one covers them. And then if we're gonna have 2, why not have 3? It's nice and symmetric. So 3 bishops are needed to ordain 1 priest. And then of course, any bishop, once they are consecrated, was a priest before they were a bishop, which means they were ordained by a bishop who was touched by 3 bishops, and so on and on and on. As you can imagine, in order to get an American bishop, you needed to go back to the motherland. Post-revolution, England was not too happy with America, or with the Americans in general, which included American Anglican Christians or new Episcopalians. There is a nice, long, fun story about how we got to our first bishop that begins on March 25th, 1783. So 1783, not too long after the Revolution ends, 10 clergy in Connecticut gather together and they elected a man named Samuel Seabury to become the first bishop of America. As a side note, just because I think it's very fun, if any of you have seen Hamilton, you know that there is one scene where a priest, a clergy person, comes out, steps up on a little box and starts to read about how we should be faithful to England and faithful to blah, blah, blah. And then the founders kind of throw him off the stage. That man is Samuel Seabury, so we can be proud. Samuel Seabury is elected to be the first American bishop in the Diocese of Connecticut. Now, in order for Samuel Seabury to be consecrated a bishop, you need what? 3 bishops. Since there aren't any in America at this point, Samuel Seabury sails back to England and appeals to the English leadership and to canon law to request a consecration for him to become the first bishop of America. Part of a consecration of a clergy person to become a bishop is taking an oath of allegiance to the English crown. Not a surprise. Seabury refuses to allow an oath to the crown to be part of his consecration, right? America just went through all this, and so Seabury is not going to be the first bishop in the Episcopal Church that pledges allegiance to the English crown right after the Revolution. And so the English leadership, knowing that Seabury would decline, said they were not allowed to consecrate him as a bishop. So in a sense, England gets a little petty revenge on America by refusing to consecrate an American bishop. Now, Seabury went back and forth and tried to figure out how he could get around this, but the English leadership refused. Now, think back to your history. Who near England I'll correct myself. There's a group of people who live near England who don't really like the English. And they also had a branch of the Anglican Church. Can you think of some? Many of you probably think of a few. But I'm talking about the Scots. People in Scotland did not care for England very much, and even though England was in charge of Scotland at this point, they would not resist, or could not resist, an opportunity to kind of thumb their nose at the English. And so Seabury realizes that if he goes up to Scotland, he may find better success. So Seabury travels up to Scotland. The Scottish bishops are thrilled to be able to annoy the English bishops. And so on November 14th, 1984, in Aberdeen, Scotland, Samuel Seabury is consecrated the first bishop of the Episcopal Church. Now America, the Episcopal Church, has a bishop. And that opens the floodgates to the real capacity to begin ordaining priests for the Episcopal Church. So by 1786, English clergy changed the law so that Church of England could offer Episcopal consecration outside of England. And as I noted before, the American Church, the Episcopal Church, began to transition the Church of England to national churches as expressions of Anglicanism around the world. That means that a colony in, say, South Africa had been just the Church of England. But now, because of the Episcopal Church's establishment in America, it opens the doors to places like, say, the South African colony to become the South African Church of England, or the Anglican Church in South Africa, just like we have the Anglican Church in Canada and on and on. The Church of England changed their law to allow for consecration of bishops in those other places because they realized if they didn't, then they were going to lose all control, lose all authority, and they'd rather keep what authority they can than to lose it all altogether. On February 4th, 1787, the Archbishop of Canterbury and 3 other English bishops consecrated William White as Bishop of Pennsylvania and Samuel Prevost as Bishop of New York. So by February of 1787, we have 3 American bishops. We've got Seabury, then we've got White in Pennsylvania and Prevost in New York. So New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut all have a bishop consecrated in either England or Scotland, and that allows the 3 of them to begin to consecrate other bishops in America. So it takes 3 consecrations in England and Scotland before America has the ability to begin to propagate their own bishops within the Episcopal Church. Now let's continue on with the early development of the Episcopal Church, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. So as I noted, once the bishops were consecrated and they could propagate new bishops, the church needed a very formal structure. I already alluded to, or really kind of, more than alluded to, I explained, the way that our church is structured. But to just pin it down, in 1789, all of the American Episcopal churches, really Anglican churches in America, gathered in Philadelphia. It unified all of these Anglican Christians in the U.S. under a single national church called the Episcopal Church. Now, as I implied earlier, the reason that we have a different name in our church, we could have been the Anglican Church in the United States or the Anglican Church of America, just like every other church around the world is the Anglican Church of whatever country that they're in. The reason we are the Episcopal Church is because it was, how might I put it, not a good idea to yoke yourself to England after the Revolution. So instead, they devised a new name, Episcopal. Episcopal Church is literally a church of bishops, right? We are a church where bishops are at the functional top of the hierarchy, and Episcopal is bishops. So the episcopate is the bishop's office, and Episcopal Church is a church of bishops. And so we adopted this language to effectively screen or make a little fuzzy our connection to England. Even though anyone who knew anything knew that we were the branch of the Church of England, at least it didn't say Anglican or English on the church's front door. So, 1789 unifies all Episcopalians under a single church structure, and it was after that that they created constitutions along with a set of canon laws that helped to govern the church all the way through today. The canon laws that were established early on were added to, but not substantially changed over the next couple hundred years by subsequent general conventions. Each of the self-supporting congregations help support their diocese. Dioceses pay into the National Episcopal Church. And so we function, at St. Michael, we collect gifts from our members, from people like you and me, and then we make a gift to our diocese to help support the work of the bishop, and then the diocese in turn makes a gift to the Episcopal Church, to our national offices in New York that help to run the global operations of the Episcopal Church around the world. And the Episcopal Church is not a huge number of people when it comes to Anglicans around the world, but we do have a lot of influence because we have the majority of the money. Interesting note, one of the differences about Anglicans here in America than, say, in almost any other place in the world, in particular in England, is that we have kind of melded a sense of Christianity that we've gleaned from our sisters and brothers in other Protestant churches in America, where giving matters in a significant way, because it does. But in England, because there is a tie to the government, giving has never really been a part of their culture. Unfortunately, I think people miss out when they don't give financially to their church. And so it changes the dynamic on a global scale. The Episcopal Church has a lot of money to do good work, whereas other churches inherited the English way of the government subsidizes the church, which means the church has enough to function, but not enough to thrive. And right now around the world, if the Anglican Church is doing something significant and good, odds are the funding mechanism, if not the organization itself doing that good work, is coming out of America. And so we can be very proud of that we may not have quite the numbers of members as other places in the world, but we do carry the load of doing this good mission work and helping meet needs of people all around the world. And of course, those of you who've been involved with mission and outreach at St. Michael know that many of the organizations that we support or the work that we actually go and do physically is connected to Anglican churches in other parts of the world. It's a really excellent way to help do global ministry in this age when we have work here locally and internationally to attend to. So as we consider the way that the Episcopal Church has changed, the way that the church has transitioned over the last few years, I don't want to get into the 20th century because that's what next week's lesson will be about. But I do want to say a word about the theology of Anglicanism that has allowed the Episcopal Church to sort of become what it has become recently. Part of the establishment of our church in the late 18th century allowed for these houses of legislation, these bodies to think through rules about how we share a common life together. And just as America has processes to change laws, so does the Episcopal Church. That's very different than many other churches. If you take, say, a Catholic or Orthodox churches, it is a total strict hierarchy of ordained leaders, right? What the Pope says goes. What the cardinals say go or the bishops say goes, that's it. The Episcopal Church really developed a way of being as a faith community that allowed everyone to weigh in on some of those important decisions. So we're not all subject only to leadership by bishops, even though bishops yield a lot of authority. Individuals like us still have a way of bringing up ideas about how we can continue to evolve the way that we share our community, right? The Episcopal Church has in its DNA the acknowledgement that God is still at work. We believe deep down in our souls that God is still working on us and working on the world. And as we discover and learn more about the world, about each other, about the way that we are both different and similar, we can hear God's voice and sense God's Spirit with power that allows us to change the way that we live and worship and work together to help become more and more Christ-like, more and more like the body of Christ in the world. And so the Episcopal Church, even though it's not easy, I will not lie, it is not easy, opens up the door, cracks the door just a little bit to allow us to evolve and change the way that we worship over time. This is a critical idea because I have been told, especially those of you who have been active in the Episcopal Church over the last, say, 40, 50 years, know that many things have changed. And for some people, the change is frustrating. Either it changes too slowly or it changes too sloppily. One way or the other, it can be kind of dissatisfying in the moment. But even though it's messy, I do think that the way that we allow change to happen is so very sacred. It is prayerful, it is thoughtful, it is theological, it is sacramental, and it is inclusive of everybody who has turned their lives over to Christ, who have pursued this Christian way. Our discipleship says that we matter. Our baptism says that we are loved by God no matter who we are. And the Episcopal Church, in a very tangible way, honors that each one of us matters. Now, I agree, it is imperfect, but we are human and we are imperfect. I do think when you look at the broad stroke of big church bodies, we do a decent job at listening for the Spirit and the way that the Spirit works and engaging as many people as possible in God's work in the world. One last note, just so that we can set ourselves up for what will be, I think, a very interesting conversation next week. The Episcopal Church is part of the root of a lot of other churches. In particular, the Methodist Church. The Wesley brothers, who founded the Methodist Church, were Anglican priests. And you may have heard me say this before, but they were students in England, and they believed that very specific and intentional habits could be built that helped move you closer and closer to God. In their words, move you closer and closer to perfection in Christ. Well, the methods that they used to help create those habits were a little countercultural. They were not the norm in England at the time. So their colleagues, their classmates, made fun of them, and they called them Methodists because of the methods that they established in order to help them grow their discipleship. Well, fast forward, and they came to America, and they began to do ministry in America, and they found America to be this fertile ground where they could be creative and they could actually employ their methods to help people in their own discipleship. So Methodism, all the Methodists you know, are really rooted in the Anglican Church. Not necessarily the Episcopal Church, but in Anglicanism. And we can thank the Methodists for helping to expand God's kingdom in very particular ways that are not the same, but are real close cousins to what we do as the Episcopal Church. In America, in the 19th and 20th centuries, I know you heard last week just a smidgen about the Great Awakening. You had some incredible moments where people helped to expand the kingdom in some meaningful ways. I will say, the Episcopal Church in America was really not a part of any of those movements, but there were Episcopalians present all over the country, north and south, that were in the neighborhood and in the communities in which those great awakenings took place, or the establishment of the Methodist Church or the Baptist churches, and on and on. Episcopalians were present with all of those shifts. And I do think that the influence of the Episcopal Church cannot be overstated within America, but whether that's in leadership of the country or in the expansion across the country, Episcopalians went forward and helped plant churches all through the 19th and 20th century with a lot of energy and a lot of vision, as much as almost any other group of people, and we can be proud of that. So that ends our lesson for today, Episcopal Beginnings. Stick with us, because next week we're going to transition from kind of the beginnings of the Episcopal Church in America to the ways in which the Episcopal Church has expanded over time all the way until the modern age, and a bit more talk about the way that the Episcopal Church functions, not 200-300 years ago, but right now. Glad to see you all this morning. Happy Easter once again, and God bless you.